You put on a jacket this morning without thinking about it. You grabbed it off a hook. You pulled it over your shoulders. You walked outside. It felt normal, almost invisible, like breathing. But the real answer to why you did that is far stranger than you think. Clothing is not just fabric. It is a message from your ancestors written on your skin, still being read today. Your body remembers something your mind has forgotten. What if the reason you get dressed every morning has almost nothing to do with fashion, and almost everything to do with survival, shame, and a war your species fought against its own biology? Start with the obvious question. Why do humans wear clothes at all? Every other primate on Earth walks around naked. Chimpanzees don't shiver through winter in little sweaters. Gorillas don't wrap themselves in leaves before a storm. So why did one branch of ape somewhere in Africa decide that bare skin wasn't enough? The old answer was simple. Humans got cold, so humans covered up. Modesty came later, as a cultural add-on. That story feels tidy. It fits the way people like to imagine the past, as a straight line from primitive need to modern comfort. But it is almost certainly wrong, or at least badly incomplete. Here is the strange part. Humans didn't start out needing clothes for warmth. Humans started out needing something else entirely, something tied to survival on the African savanna, long before anyone dreamed of a coat. Around 2 million years ago, your ancestors lost their fur. Not gradually faded it, like a sweater wearing thin. They lost almost all of it, keeping only patches on the head and a few strategic places. This is bizarre for a mammal living in the open sun. Every other large animal on the savanna, lions, antelope, elephants, kept a coat of hair or fur for protection. Fur insulates against cold nights. Fur shields skin from the sun. Fur even repels biting insects. Losing it looks, on the surface, like a terrible evolutionary mistake. So why would evolution strip that protection away? The leading explanation involves heat, but not the heat you're imagining. Researchers studying human thermoregulation, including work associated with biologist Nina Jablonski, point to a different kind of danger. Early humans were becoming persistent hunters. They were chasing prey across long, brutal distances under the equatorial sun, on 2 legs, for hours at a time, sometimes for an entire day, until the animal being chased simply collapsed from heat exhaustion. Running that long generates enormous internal heat. A body covered in thick fur would overheat and die long before the prey did. Losing fur solved that problem. Bare skin lets sweat evaporate freely, cooling the body far more efficiently than any furred animal could manage. Humans developed millions of sweat glands, far more than any other primate, turning the entire surface of the body into a cooling system. Humans became, in a very real sense, the best long-distance cooling machines on the planet. That's a strange kind of superpower, isn't it? Losing your fur made you faster, not weaker. But this created a brand new problem. Bare skin under direct equatorial sun is dangerous. Ultraviolet radiation destroys folate in the blood, which is critical for reproduction and healthy fetal development. It damages skin cells over time, raising the risk of cancer. So the same evolutionary pressure that stripped away fur also darkened the skin, filling it with protective melanin, especially near the equator where the sun burns hardest and the risk is greatest. Now picture the migration. Your ancestors eventually left Africa. They pushed north into Europe, into Central Asia, into places with brutal winters and thin, weak sunlight. Darker skin, so useful under the equatorial sun, became a liability in the cold north. It absorbed too little sunlight to produce enough vitamin D, a nutrient the body can only manufacture through sun exposure on the skin. Skin lightened over generations in these colder regions, a slow genetic negotiation with the sun, trading protection from burning for the ability to make enough vitamin D to survive. But skin adaptation is slow. Genetic change takes tens of thousands of years to spread through a population. Winter in northern Europe does not wait tens of thousands of years to kill you. A single brutal season can end a life or an entire small band of people long before any gene has time to shift. So something else had to fill the gap between the body humans had and the world they were now living in. That something was clothing. Here is where the story gets genuinely strange, and where science found an unexpected witness. Not a fossil, not a cave painting, a parasite. In the early 2000s, geneticist Mark Stoneking and colleagues studied human body lice. Head lice have existed on humans for millions of years, living in scalp hair, clinging close to warm skin. But body lice are different. They live specifically in clothing, laying their eggs in the seams of fabric, feeding on skin only through cloth, and dying quickly without it. Body lice could not have existed before humans were something to live in. Their entire biology depends on the existence of fabric. So Stoneking's team compared the DNA of human body lice to human head lice, measuring how long ago the two populations genetically diverged from a common ancestor. The number that came back was extraordinary. Roughly 170,000 years ago, give or take. That is the approximate moment, according to this genetic clock, when humans first began regularly wearing clothing. Think about what that number means. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for around 300,000 years. For roughly half of that entire span, your ancestors lived completely naked, exposed to weather, insects, and injury with nothing but skin between them and the world. Generation after generation, they endured cold nights, thorny brush, biting wind, all without a single layer of protection beyond their own bare hide. Then, sometime around 170,000 years ago, something changed. What changed? Likely climate. That period overlaps with a major glacial phase, when parts of the world humans were beginning to inhabit turned brutally cold, far colder than anything their bodies had evolved to handle. Clothing wasn't a fashion choice. It was a survival technology, arriving at almost exactly the moment it became necessary to keep bodies alive in freezing new environments. This is where anthropologist Ian Gilligan's research adds another layer. Gilligan has argued that clothing wasn't just a response to cold, it was a prerequisite for migration into cold regions at all. Humans couldn't have spread into Ice Age Europe or Siberia without some form of insulation between skin and freezing air. Clothing didn't just help humans survive the cold. Clothing is arguably the reason humans could go there in the first place. Without it, entire continents would have stayed permanently out of reach. Pause on that for a second. Every human alive today whose ancestors lived through an Ice Age winter is descended from someone who solved a wardrobe problem before science even existed. No zippers, no sewing machines, just scraped hides, sinew thread, and bone needles, engineering survival stitch by stitch, in the dark, by firelight, with frozen fingers. And here's the twist that makes this stranger still. Archaeological evidence for bone needles, the kind fine enough to sew fitted, wind-resistant clothing rather than simple draped hides, appears even later, around 40,000 years ago in some regions. That gap between the lice-derived date of roughly 170,000 years and needle evidence around 40,000 years suggests something important. Early clothing wasn't sewn garments at all. It was probably simple, unfitted wraps of hide or fur, thrown over the body like a cloak, tied at the shoulder with a strip of leather. Only much later did humans develop the tools to tailor clothing to the shape of the human form. So clothing has two separate origin stories folded into one. First, crude insulation, probably little more than draped animal skins, appearing tens of thousands of years before anyone could sew. Second, fitted, engineered clothing, arriving with needle technology, allowing humans to survive in far colder, harsher environments than loose hides ever could. This second leap mattered enormously. Fitted clothing, tied at the wrists and ankles, trapping warm air against the body instead of letting it escape, is estimated by some researchers to have made survival possible in temperatures many degrees colder than draped hides alone could handle. That difference in degrees might sound small. In an actual Ice Age winter, with wind cutting across open tundra, it was the difference between a living population and an extinct one. It may even explain why anatomically modern humans eventually outcompete other hominin groups living in similarly cold regions of Europe and Asia. Better tailored clothing, layered and fitted, may have been a quiet but decisive advantage. Consider what this means for something as simple as a hood. A hood traps warm air directly around head and neck, where the body loses an enormous amount of its heat. Someone, somewhere tens of thousands of years ago, figured that out through trial and freezing error and passed the idea on. That single design choice, repeated and refined across countless winters, is still sitting on the back of the jacket hanging in your closet today. Now here's the modern mirror, the part where ancient survival tech quietly becomes something else entirely. Once clothing existed for warmth, it almost immediately picked up new meanings. Archaeological sites show ornamented clothing far earlier than practical necessity alone would explain. Beads, dyed fibers, deliberately arranged patterns, sewn onto garments that already did their job of keeping a body warm. Clothing became identity. It became status. It became a way of saying something about who you were before you ever opened your mouth. A hunter with more decoration on his hide cloak was, in some communities, signaling skill or rank. A woman with certain shell beads sewn along a hem may have been signaling which group she belonged to or which family she had married into. Psychologists have long studied how clothing changes behavior, not just perception. A phenomenon researchers call unclothed cognition, studied by psychologist Hajo Adam and colleagues at Northwestern University, found that wearing specific garments actually changes how people perform on cognitive tasks. In one well-known experiment, participants wearing a lab coat they believed belonged to a doctor performed better on sustained attention tasks than participants wearing the exact same coat when told it was a painter's coat. Same fabric, same fit, different meaning, different brain. The clothing physically hadn't changed at all, yet the story attached to it was enough to shift how carefully people paid attention to their own work. That should stop you for a second. The clothing itself did nothing physically different. Only the meaning changed, and that was enough to shift attention, performance, even self-perception in a controlled laboratory setting with adults who fully understood on some level that a coat is just a coat. Which means the jacket you grabbed off the hook this morning was never just insulation. It was doing exactly what animal hides did for a freezing human in an Ice Age valley 80,000 years ago, announcing something to the world and to yourself before a single word was spoken. Think about the outfit you choose for a job interview. Think about why certain clothes feel like armor and others feel like exposure. Think about how differently you carry your body in sweatpants at home versus in a sharp jacket walking into an important room, shoulders a little straighter, chin a little higher. None of that is really about temperature. It's about identity, signaling, and the ancient human habit of using cloth to tell a story about who is inside it. There is a deeper layer to this signaling instinct, one that stretches back further than any woven fabric. Even before true clothing existed, evidence suggests early humans used red ochre pigment on bare skin, rubbed directly onto the body in patterns. Some researchers see this as an early form of the same impulse that later drove decorated garments, a need to mark the body as meaningful, as belonging to a group, as more than just flesh standing in the wind. Clothing didn't invent that impulse. Clothing simply gave it a new surface to work on, a surface that could be washed, changed, layered, and passed down. Consider, too, how clothing quietly organized early human society in ways that had nothing to do with keeping warm. Producing a single fitted hide garment, scraping the skin clean, curing it, cutting it, sewing it with a bone needle and sinew thread could take many hours of skilled labor. That labor had to be learned, practiced, and passed from one person to another, usually across generations. Anthropologists studying surviving hunter-gatherer groups have noted that clothing production was often one of the first specialized skills in early human communities, alongside toolmaking. Some individuals became known as the best at it. Their garments were sought after, perhaps traded, perhaps admired. Skill with a needle, in other words, may have been one of humanity's very first professions. There is one more twist worth sitting with. Remember that humans lost their fur to survive as endurance hunters in the heat, then spent tens of thousands of years slowly reinventing that fur out of animal skins and woven fiber, just to survive everywhere else on the planet. In a strange, circular way, clothing is humanity regrowing the coat evolution took away. Except this new coat could be removed, redesigned, dyed, and reinvented endlessly. Fur was fixed by genetics, locked in place across generations. Clothing was freed from that constraint entirely. That freedom changed everything. A fur coat cannot be swapped for a lighter one when the seasons shift overnight. A woven garment can. A fixed pelt cannot signal wealth, rank, mourning, celebration, or rebellion depending on the day. Fabric can do all of that in a single afternoon simply by being changed. Humans didn't just replace what evolution took away. Humans built something evolution never could have produced on its own, a covering that adapts faster than any body ever will, that can be dyed for a funeral one week and brightened for a wedding the next. Even now, thousands of years later, you can feel the ghost of that same negotiation every time the weather shifts. A cold morning sends you reaching for a heavier layer, almost without a conscious decision. the same instinct that once sent a hand reaching for a hide by a dying fire. A hot afternoon sends you shedding a layer, seeking bare skin and moving air, echoing the exact cooling strategy that stripped your ancestors of fur 2 million years ago in the first place. You are, every single day, running a tiny simulation of the entire evolutionary story, layer by layer, without ever noticing it. So the next time you get dressed, notice what you're actually doing. You are participating in one of the oldest technologies your species ever invented, older than agriculture, older than the wheel, older than written language by tens of thousands of years. You're also participating in something evolutionarily strange, undoing, artificially, the very adaptation that once made your ancestors the fastest, coolest-running hunters on the African plain. Every layer you put on is a quiet echo of a body that once ran naked under an unforgiving sun, and later froze in valleys it should never have been able to survive and found a way through anyway. Not through new skin, not through new fur. Through an idea, draped over the shoulders, stitched tighter across generations, carried forward by hands that had no idea they were solving a problem that would still matter to you, on an ordinary morning, reaching for a jacket on a hook. Think about how quickly this simple idea reshaped the map of the entire planet. Without clothing, humans stay confined to warm latitudes, tied to the climate their bare skin could tolerate. With it, humans cross into Siberia, into the Arctic Circle, into landscapes so cold that an unprotected body would die within hours. Every population living today above a certain latitude exists only because some distant ancestor solved the problem of covering skin well enough to outlast a winter that should have killed them. That is not a small footnote in human history. That is one of the reasons humans became the only species to inhabit nearly every corner of the Earth, from equatorial rainforest to frozen tundra, wearing a borrowed coat their own biology never grew. You didn't just get dressed this morning. You repeated an act of survival that is, in the truest sense, older than your own species' entire modern existence, and stranger than a jacket has any right to be.